You heard it too. You do, don't you? Hello. But up here, in the attic, the sounds were the loudest, especially in the dark. You did it! You got proof! We have to go show Mom.
Do you think there's what in the walls, dear?
Wolves.
Who told you there were wolves in the walls? Pig puppet.
No, but we heard them.
It can't be wolves, Loopy.
Did you see that?
It can't possibly be wolves.
Because you know what they say.
When the wolves come out of the walls,
It's all over. Everybody knows this.
You believe me, don't you?
Da 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 da. Ya da 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 da.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Cool. Yeah, so that's the piece. That should give you a little sense of the tone and sort of what we were going for. So keep that in mind as we're sort of talking about it. I want to talk a little bit about myself and where I came from, so you know that you can trust me. I haven't been doing this for all that long because there hasn't been that long to do it. But I started VR design thinking and stuff like that in college at Penn State, and then went on to do a grad school program in VR design at CMU. And then I got my first job at Viacom doing promotional work for them. We worked on a game called Smash Party, which was working with Titmouse Animation Studios. If you guys know, they do Adult Swim animated content like Metalocalypse, and I think they've also done episodes of like Legend of Korra and stuff like that. Then I came from there to work on Wolves in 2018. And one thing to note, I know like a focus of the BAYCAT program is you guys like finding different ways into the industry. And I think one of the cool things about VR is like, even though I went a really traditional route to get here, it's that helped me be really early in it, which is to say, you know, starting in around 2014. But it's such a democratized medium. There's so many ways in right now because so many of the tools that you use are easily accessible. There's so many tutorials and stuff online. So it is a pretty accessible medium right now. I think that there's something really cool about what's being done in VR and just sort of like this sort of punk rock way that things are being slapped together. So, but yeah, one of the most important things on this slide is that I joined the Wolves team in 2018, which means that I only worked on Wolves for the last 2 years of its development. It was about a 4-year project. And I came to this company called Fable. And Fable was not actually always Fable. They were called Oculus Story Studio. But they were at some point underneath Facebook when Facebook bought Oculus. And then Oculus sort of spun them out, sold it into Fable. There's like some corporate-y stuff that happened, but it doesn't really matter. But what does matter is that Story Studio put together a lot of really amazing early VR entertainment content. They were focused on the idea of bringing people from like Pixar animation, like Pixar DreamWorks animators, together with game makers, just to take the idea of putting somebody inside of a Pixar movie by taking game engine programming and just putting high quality animation into it. So the first attempt at this was the short called Lost. It was about 3.5 minutes long. And this is what we call a gold spike. It's like the idea of a gold spike is like joining two railroads that are disconnected. This was this gold spike experience of how do we even get these people to work together? The animators who came from, you know, fully highly rendered, you know, feature film and these AAA game makers to work together to make something that's like emotionally resonant. But it also explored some interesting topics in VR, the first things that people think of when they think of like the sort of problems with VR storytelling. And that's like, how do you make sure people are looking in the right direction? And how do you, what do you do with the size of somebody? How does that affect, how does space and scale affect your emotional experience of the story? So lots of really interesting things explored even in that first piece. And then there's this short called Henry, starting to get a little bit longer, is more traditional short film length, about 10 minutes. And Henry is about this little hedgehog, and nobody wants to come to his birthday party because every time he gives them a hug, it hurts. So one of the most amazing things about Henry is they discovered the power of having a character who you're sharing space with acknowledge your presence by looking you in the eye. And there's this funny thing that happens that they actually call the Swayze effect, like Patrick Swayze from Ghost, where he does look at you and it makes you feel like you're there and that you're noticed, but the rest of the story goes on as if you're not there. And they decided to leave the eye contact in because it was so powerful, but it actually undercuts the story. That's something that Wolves would eventually come back and explore the idea of sharing space with a character who's really connecting to you and really leaning into it, where Henry was sort of like this crazy experiment that happened to work. But right before Wolves, its other sort of grandparent, its ancestor, was this amazing piece called Dear Angelica. This is probably, besides Wolves, my favorite piece of VR content. It is an absolutely gorgeous, beautiful narrative that is just narration over top of these changing paintings that you're sort of inside of. And it just really points at the emotional power of VR, like the raw, hard-hitting, like right to your heartstrings sort of way that you can just use imagery and sounds. And I've not seen anybody come out of this not in tears. It is a beautiful piece of work. So I highly recommend it if you can see it. But what it taught us for Wolves was the power of using imagery and color and space to tell a story, and that'll come up again. But so the next endeavor for Story Studio was Wolves in the Walls, and it was about taking this character in this book and this atmosphere developed by Neil Gaiman into this medium. But specifically with this new technology in mind, the idea of what they called the touch controllers. As you can kind of see in this illustration, like the idea is that if you haven't gotten a chance to experience this, you use a VR controller and it puts your hands into the virtual world, and suddenly you have a way to interact. And what's really important is psychologically, that affects your proprioception, like the embodiedness of yourself in the world, and suddenly you're not a viewer, you are much more present there. And this has a really huge effect on storytelling. And so Wolves was going to be this attempt at like, what do we do when this thing, it was actually going to be when this thing launches. We were about 2 years late. But how do we tell stories with this new tool? And the first explorations were just, you know, this is called Toy Box. It was like the first demo of this technology, and all you could do was, it's you and another person in VR, both of whom are like connected over the internet, and you're just touching things. There's stuff to pick up. You can throw stuff to each other. There's like, you know, weird toys and that you're playing with. And so, you know, the first most obvious thing that you get out of that is like, what does it feel like to be able to pick something up and manipulate it and see how, you know, it's put together, like what kind of story you could tell by manipulating objects. That feels kind of obvious, but then something that I think was unexpectedly found here is the power of sharing space being there again. I mean, after Henry, coming back to this, being in a space with a character and what that means and how you share space by using interactive objects, passing things from one person to another. And so it kind of, these two games that were relevant at the time, still really relevant, but they were new then, Gone Home and BioShock Infinite. Show of hands, like anybody know these games, like know about them? Jason, big thumbs up from Jason. Sabian, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Yeah, so yeah, Gone Home fits in with this idea of like story of Gone Home. You play as a girl who comes back from study abroad to her parents' home, and nobody's there, and all that's there are the objects in this house and some moving boxes and things, and you have to figure out what the story of what happened is by picking through objects and pulling things. You could see like this is like examine photo. That's the verbs in this game, right? And then BioShock Infinite, this totally other example where it's a traditional first-person shooter, except you have this companion along with you the whole time. This is the character's name is Elizabeth, and she's you know, probably the biggest part of what makes that a unique experience is her story is the one that you're interested in. She's helping you along, she's helping you discover your story, but she's this really rich character with these interactions that really are emotionally resonant. And so those two became really highly inspirational pieces. And I'll come back especially to BioShock later on. But so, you know, with that in mind, now it's like, okay, let's start prototyping. There's a huge part of the VR development process is just like, what does it look like to get your hands dirty and see what this stuff feels like? So let's put a character in VR in the headset. What does it look like if she's looking at you? What about if we held your hand? What if, you know, we had this accordion and you pull it back and forth, she starts dancing. And like starting to find the things that feel like they're going to be rich emotional moments so that you can put that into the story. And it starts working because Story Studio's been working together for a while and people are gelling. But there are these sort of impasses, these big questions come up about, okay, well now we're really going to be telling a story with a character who is a player, who's a participant. What's their role going to be like? And like, what does that mean for the way that we have to tell this story and the interactivity? And like, should it be fun? Should it be this challenging game? Or should it be, what is the level of interactivity that lends itself to storytelling? And then, yeah, how do we do all that and still maintain people's attention and make it an interesting thing, but not impossible to follow either. And so, it was a while before people found out like how to deal with this. And so the heads of the creative leads, they take a trip to New York and they go see an interactive theater piece called Then She Fell by a company called Third Rail Projects. And interactive theater, for those of you who aren't familiar, is like this experience where you go into a space and share that space with actors, and those actors are going to be acting around you. In Then She Fell, you go into like a Brooklyn brownstone and there's different rooms, and in each of the rooms there's different characters, and sometimes they speak to you, sometimes they ask you questions, sometimes they ask you to do stuff, or sometimes they just sort of dance ballet around you in the space. But it's all about sharing a space with the character and with the narrative. And what's amazing is they're working from this other direction. Here we have all these people from the game side of things saying like, let's push toward interactivity, let's make this fun, let's make it engaging and exciting. And you have these theater people who are just like, well, what happens if we put the stage on the ground? And what happens if we share space with these people? And they're just going to start reaching out a little bit more to the audience, and not so much trying to like make it this fun, exciting experience, because it will be exciting if you tell the story well. And so that was really inspirational. We learned a ton from them. So a lot of this talk is going to be talking about what we learned from them. But really, it was just unlocking this new way of thinking. Kind of like, what is the role of the audience? What's what kind of powers do you get from staging and set design? and body language and what it's like to have a social experience with a character. What does that do for your storytelling? So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the role of the player, because I think that it's one of the most counterintuitive parts of this, and it's one of the things that makes me love VR storytelling so much, is what do we do with this person who's there in the experience? And I think I want to talk a little bit about this concept of presence in VR. Presence with like a capital P is this sort of term in VR academia. It's like it's been studied since the 60s when they were doing virtual reality, early virtual reality studies for military simulation and stuff. And presence is the ability to, or a measurement of how much you are like there in the experience, how much your brain is truly convinced that you are in a different space. So if you've ever done a 360 VR experience where it's like a filmed experience, you may have felt like some low levels of presence, maybe when the sound design is really good, or like, but if you've ever used a current VR headset like the one that this girl is wearing in here, like, or anything where you have your hands involved, suddenly, and this is kind of a controversial opinion in the industry, but so take it with a grain of salt, but for me, presence is then yours to break. It's with the current technology, presence is handed to you on a silver platter. It's not something that we have to strive for like we used to have to. You have the ability to immediately put somebody in a new space and have them totally forget their surroundings. And it's just, if only bad decisions will make it worse. It's good decisions are going to help, but you're already so much of the way there. And that's really great, but it does have an interesting effect on what the role of the audience, of the player, is going to be. And I'm going to go through a really weird example for this, but trust me, it makes sense. Doom is an example of a game that's like the most video game-ass video game that there is. It's like kill things, shoot things, be big, be strong. And it is a beautifully designed game if you're a game designer, even though it's like gory and disgusting. It is like every bit of its design leads toward this feeling of like, I am big and I am strong and I am a demon slayer. I am this guy who, you know, goes down to hell and kills demons, and it casts you in that role perfectly. As soon as you pick up the controller, you feel that. What's great about this as a case study, though, is there is a VR version of Doom. It's called Doom VFR, which stands for virtual fucking reality, and because they're very extra and it's great. But they took most of the game systems and they put them in VR, and it was like, okay, let's go be the Doom guy. Let's be like big and strong. And you know, as beautifully crafted as this game is, it hits up against this core problem of presence. Because when I'm in Doom VFR, I'm not the Doom guy. I'm me. I'm standing on my floor, and I'm me-sized. And I know what it's like to be me strength, and I know what it's like to be me sized. And I'm me. I'm just in this new world. And so everything that I'm interacting with is telling me about this new world as it compares to me. So best case scenario, that's like, you know, I have great tools. I have big, strong tools. I have Doom level tools. But worst case scenario, and what kind of happens most often, is I am like, this world is weak. This world is like, it's not substantial. And you lose what is, to game makers, such an easy core fantasy to hit, this like power fantasy. It totally falls apart because of this sort of inverse fantasy that presence hits at. So in that way, presence can be this double-edged sword. It's like this beautiful thing that you have that you can just put somebody in any world you can imagine, but you have to remember that you're putting them into it. Like, they are themselves. And if you can really lean on that, like, you can really tell a beautiful story. And that's what we hope to do with wolves. The way that in immersive theater, this is a screen, I keep saying screenshot, but this is a photo from Sleep No More, which is another immersive theater piece where everybody in those masks, that's an audience member. And so they're there, they came to witness this, and they're just themselves. And the whole action of the story takes place in a way that, you know, you can be there and bring yourself to it. And the story is just about reaching out a little bit when it makes sense to bring that person into the experience, but not trying to convince them that there's somebody else. And if you're going to play yourself, what role will you play? That was the next question, because we knew we were going to be, you know, you're you in VR, because that's easy. It's not impossible to change that, but that's what's easy, and we're going to do that. What role will you play? And so we thought, you know, we all came from game making, and the protagonist makes a lot of sense, right? Like all these characters, they're iconic because they're the protagonists, the heroes of their story. And so we're used to casting players as the protagonist, but you know, when you think about game storytelling, I think that it's counterintuitive, but I don't really think we are the protagonist when we play games. I like using this guy as an example. This is Kratos. He's from the God of War series. And when I was a kid and my bloodlust was high and I was 14 and I needed to kill stuff, there were some amazing games about doing just that, and that's all you did. And he wasn't a great character. He was like just a big meathead that killed stuff, and that's what I wanted. And just like I did, the developers grew up a little bit, and recently they re-released the game, and they decided to take the same character, put him a little bit of ways in the future. We don't know what happened, but now he has a son. And what does it mean when you have this two-dimensional character suddenly get depth by trying to understand how this, you know, person raised in violence has to raise somebody else? And it's a beautiful story about a man learning to become a father who really isn't cut out for it. But, and I love that story. It was a gorgeous story, but I wasn't him. I wasn't Kratos. And if I was, I would make a lot different choices. I wouldn't be such a shitty dad. I'd think I'd be a pretty good dad. It'd be cool. So I wasn't the protagonist in that story. I was helping his story unfold. I was the page turner. I was the person who was just constantly letting the narrative unfold. And I think a lot of games are in denial sometimes about the way that they tell stories, because I think most of them are that way. And a lot of the ways that the best game stories, this is from a game called Uncharted, which is like often hailed as one of the best adventure stories in games. And you're watching this character go through this amazing character arc, and it's fun and it's exciting, but you're just there for the action scenes. You're there to help turn the page, because the story is going to keep going the way that it's going to go. And I don't think that's bad. You know, I think that this really points at what games can be good at if we really embrace the philosophy of the interactive audience. You know, we're doing so many things right if we just let that, we don't fight against that notion that like we can minimize that misalignment of sense of self, that double-edged sort of presence. And then, you know, writers can write like they want to write. They don't have to try and change a person's mentality. And you can maintain the pace for dramatic tension the way that you would with any other sort of storytelling. I mean, you have a little bit more control when you say that the person who's there, who's participating in this narrative, they're the audience. But they're there to interact, but they're still the audience. And in a lot of ways, this is sort of flipping the script of what games have been about. You know, in this thing here, you know, Elizabeth, that character that we talked about before, she's there. She throws you money sometimes or ammo when you're in a fight. She's there to help you. But we sort of discovered when we were making Wolves that, like, no, you're going to be the helper. It's Lucy's story that's important, and the way that we want to make that clear is everything about this, every interaction is about you helping Lucy do what she needs to do, because it's her story ultimately. And it sounds you know, like a cop out, or like, you know, you're not able to tell big grandiose stories that we want to tell, and like the promise of having the player as the protagonist just seems like so enticing. But some of our greatest stories are told this way. Sherlock Holmes, anybody who asks me about VR storytelling, I almost immediately start talking about Sherlock Holmes, because if you were to cast the player as Sherlock Holmes, they're going to spend a lot of time feeling pretty stupid, or feeling like everybody else is pretty stupid, like the world is pretty stupid. But if you cast them as Watson, you get to be in awe of somebody who is immensely smart and who has a way of interacting with the world that is different than our own. And we get to watch his character change just like Watson does. And just like the original Conan, like Arthur Conan Doyle stories are written from Watson's perspective, as like Watson is our avatar in that space, so that we can be witness to the character change of Sherlock Holmes. And I think that's a really important piece of interactive storytelling, is like allowing the person to be themselves and not be an extreme version of themselves. If you want to have extreme characters, like by all means, like have them and show them off, and this is a great way to do it. And I'm saying a lot of this stuff as if it's some sort of like truism, and it's not. It is easier in my experience, and I think that that's important. And the other thing that that allows you to do, it gets rid of this problem that play-based games, like really interactive heavy games, have with pacing. I love this Spider-Man game. Every game I'm showing here is a game that I love, but like the new Spider-Man game, it's great. You get to feel like Spider-Man, swinging around New York City. But you'll get a call on your Spidey phone, and they'll be like, Spider-Man, my house is on fire, my cat is in the tree, and you can go do that, or you can not. And it's like, you can go do that whenever you want. You know, maybe I want to go pick up some of the other side missions or whatever. But the narrative, all that narrative tension, all that like the timing of that, the immediacy of that is lost unless the player decides to role play into it. And it works for certain games, because Spider-Man shouldn't feel anxiety inducing. That wasn't the design intent of this game. But with Wolves on the Walls, we wanted there to be tension, and we wanted Lucy to be the driver of the experience, so that we could always be keeping the pace of the story and never have to rely on, you know, going at the pace of the participant, because it's just not reliable. And so in Wolves, you're you. That's what we discussed first, and you've been created to help Lucy. Your role is her imaginary friend, and you're there to help. And that really unlocks a lot of great little interactive bits, so that we can really explore all the nuances of this character and tell a character-based story in a more or less traditional way, in ways that, like, from film, we know how to tell great character stories. And now we just have this extra layer of, you know, you're there to help, and she wants to know, you know, that you're there, and give you opportunities to participate with her. But now we come, so we kind of know where we are and where she is, but let's talk a little bit about the world and staging. This was like the next sort of big lesson that we learned from Third Rail. And just like the different techniques, spotlighting, emotional point of view, which I'll talk about a little bit, and choreography, all coming from sort of this immersive theater idea. Spotlighting, first of all, is like, I love talking to people about this, because whenever I talk to film people about VR storytelling, they're like, well, if you don't have control of the camera, how are you going to control where people look? Like, how do you know that they're going to see things? Like, how do you put together a scene? And it's like, we know how to do this. We've been doing it for decades, you know, put a spotlight where you want them to look. And, you know, people might think it's contrived, but it doesn't feel that way when you're the participant. You don't really notice that, that something's off. It's just like, yeah, that's where I'm supposed to look, and that's where I'll look. And we can still operate in the round, which is this awesome thing that VR lets us do. Like in this thing, Lucy is moving from place to place. But we're just telling those little vignettes of a story. And we can also use that now to tell different spatial stories different sort of like, and play with the space of her house as she walks around and interacts with things. It also saves on render budget if anybody's used to working on like rendered projects. Like rendering everything black is awesome. So that's easy, right? So we got that, like the sort of focal points. It's not as hard as we thought. Now we've got emotional point of view. What did we do when we do have these sets? You know, they're really powerful and you can use space to your advantage. And one of the things that Third Rail, this immersive theater company, was really jealous of was our ability to manipulate space. They had to operate in the real world. They had to, like, every set had to be physically feasible. Every set change had to be done by hand. We don't have to worry about that. We're working in a digital medium, but it feels real. It feels like a real space. So what do you do when you have that power? Well, we have this concept of emotional point of view. Because you are of Lucy's imagination, you are literally drawn into existence by her. You should feel the world the way that Lucy feels the world, and so you should see the world the way that Lucy feels the world. In this piece of concept art, there's a scene where Lucy is trying to approach her dad, and she's scared, and she doesn't know what to do, and she sees him with such reverence, but such she's so tentative about it that it feels, and the whole set is set up to be like a theater where her dad is on the stage and we're up on the mezzanine with her looking down. And as she sneaks like closer and closer, the set becomes more like a jazz club. And then it's just like a practice space. And then we're there just in the real space, this real just like cramped basement where Lucy and her dad are actually just sharing a conversation. And we get to change that. An example of that too, when you saw in the trailer, when she pulls out the lights in the attic, this is like her room. This is her space that she's set up for herself. This is where she solves her mysteries. So it's cozy when the lights are on, but she's still a kid. And when the lights go out, it can get a little spooky. And so we turn the lights out, and of course we change the lighting conditions. You know, we have these cool like UV sort of like chalk drawings all over the walls. But what we do to really make you feel the difference and the spookiness is we're actually pulling the set out away from you. We're making it, we're extending it to make it feel like it's bigger, it's scarier, it's more mysterious than it is. And it really, it's something that you only get when you sort of can feel it in VR. And I think it's one of the big strengths of Wolves, and it's something that, like, when you think about what you would do, you know, if you could change your, you know, it's sort of like cinematography in its own way, in that you're changing space and the way that we relate to space on the fly and to your whim, so you can manipulate the emotions of the participant, of the audience. And the other way that we change space is actually through choreography. And this was something that, like, we would not have been able to do on our own. We partnered with Third Rail for a lot of the choreography of this piece, because the way that people move their bodies around the space, so important to the way that you feel about the story and the actors. And we talk a lot about the emotional orbits, like where is a character and how does where they are relate to how we feel about them. You know, similar to like how wide shot versus a close-up, you know, make you feel differently. It's like that on steroids. It's this idea called proxemics. This is a really well-studied social phenomenon. And that's another just like a thing that I love about VR. This is actually like, if people ask me why I make VR content, I almost always end up talking about proxemics, because it's one of these things that proves that when VR is good, it hijacks the systems in your brain that are built for the real world. And it's not about, you know, trying to suspend your disbelief anymore. It's about just using those systems to your advantage. And so proxemics is this idea, it's pretty clear in this diagram, but like there are different spaces that people exist in, and then when they change those orbits, which are well measured, well studied phenomena, when they change those orbits, you change the way you're thinking about it. It actually changes the neurons that fire in your brain. And that's something that is actually different from like a wide shot versus a close-up. You have like the actual experience of feeling somebody close in your space, right? So we use that all the time. We're pushing Lucy out into social space, and then we'll have this tension of feeling far away from her, and then we'll bring her back in for these moments we call haiku moments, where she's like really close with you. She's you know, feeling that proximity with her and feeling that intimacy. And we use it all the time. It's this constant dance. And you have to practice that, right? So we went to New York, we practiced with them, they showed us how to do it. We made a set out of cardboard boxes so that you really feel the space. And then, you know, you take those rehearsals, we started doing those on our own in our little parking lot, just like testing everything out, seeing how it feels to be in those different emotional orbits. Then we write it down in our super secret language so that we could then take it to the mocap stage and go with those same actors that we rehearsed with. Where they're taping out the marks, feeling those same things. And you can see here, this is the director, Pete Billington. He's there playing the participant, like trying to feel what it would feel like to be there. You can see he's bent down because one of the first things we do in Wolves on the Walls is we make sure that every player is sized to be at Lucy's eye level, because all that scale, all that those emotional connections are so important. So he's trying to maintain that. And while we're on this stage, we're learning so much about how people's bodies and the choreography affect the way that we interact. We learn so much from these people who are doing 8 shows a week of like random people come into their space and they have to operate on a script, except that, you know, there's just some element of chaos in there, this person who's just like there. And they really have a systematized way of thinking of body language that we never had thought about. And one of these things is like eye contact, obviously, is super important, right? We know that, that's easy, but it's actually like the rhythm of eye contact was something that we learned. There's a scene where, you know, Lucy is going and she's like going out into space. We were testing it all the time. And as the story progresses, it gets more intense, it gets more interactive. And people are like, oh, I don't feel as connected to Lucy toward the end of the story as I did at the beginning. And that was like such a bummer. And we were trying to figure out with our testers, like, how can we amplify this and make it feel better? Like, do we need to add more lines? Do we need to like get more animation in there? And we decided like every once in a while, we would just see how long we had gone without having Lucy look at the audience, at the player. And we just turned her head a little bit and had her check in, and it creates this relationship with you of, even though I'm doing my own thing, I'm going to keep making sure that you're there with me. And that rhythm of check-ins became a really important part of the body language that Lucy exhibits. The other are this idea of handoffs, like just passing an object from one person to the next, from Lucy to you. That's how that was the original thesis of Wolves on the Walls, was that was going to be how we shared space with each other. And it really does carry through. But the way that we do it is actually pretty counterintuitive. I'm going to have you watch a video, and you'll have to pay kind of close attention to Lucy's body language. And then there's also going to be a play tester there, and just kind of see what's going on with them. And I'll talk about it after that. Or maybe I could talk over it, actually. Usually this has sound. But so she's reaching in. She's going to go grab a camera for you. And she's like, you know, looking through her little trunk. You can look into it, whatever. And she goes and she's going to hand it to you. And you see that she reached there to go grab it. And this is where we first realize that you don't have hands. So Lucy has to give you them. And what's so amazing about that moment is, without fail, people will reach for that camera when Lucy hands it back. But that wasn't always the case. when Lucy would go and hand you the camera with her shoulders squared to you, there's this moment where we're asking for a choice. We're asking for defiance. You can say, oh, you're clearly handing me something, so I'm going to see what happens if I don't take it. But again, like hijacking that social part of your brain, you turn, when Lucy is not looking and she's just casually handing something to you, she's trusting you in that moment. Without fail, people will reach for that. So we play with that. We make that the time that you realize that you don't have hands yet. And I will say, I've played this experience at least 100 times, and like still almost every time, like if I'm not thinking about it, I will reach for that camera because it's just so viscerally in your bones that you want to help, that you're using that social part of your brain that's so subconscious. And so sometimes that works really well. I mean, we hand things off all the time, but we deal with different types of participants. And this is where, when you're dealing with interactivity, you really do have to consider your audience. And so ideally, you know, Lucy hands something, you grab it, then she goes and she models the behavior of what you're going to do with it. In this case, you're listening to the wall and you're going to listen for sounds together. But it doesn't always go that way, right? Sometimes people are like not exactly sure what you're asking them to do, especially before we had final animation in there. And then they're also like looking around. We built these beautiful sets, and you know, you can just miss it, right? So, okay, what's the solution for that? We'll make it longer. We'll have Lucy just wait longer if you don't look, but you'll have people who miss it for another reason. You know, maybe they want to see what happens if they don't take it, you know. And it's not a big deal. This is what games most of the time do. They wait for you to interact. But like, this comes back to that BioShock example. Ken Levine, who is the director of BioShock, he has this great quote about Elizabeth, where he says, that moment that you come up against a character who's just sort of standing there, or behaves robotically, or behaves in a way that's so alien to what you'd expect of a human being, you just shut them off and you say, oh, they're just a video game character. I don't need to worry about feeling anything about them. And that's like the core thing, right? Like, everything we can do in this experience has been about making sure that Lucy doesn't feel like a video game character. And so that roboticism, that like those little loops, it's not acceptable for us, right? So we had to build a system. And when we're thinking about this system, you know, we started talking about interactive theater, and we thought, like, what would Lucy do if she were an actor? Because, and it's important to say an actor, not a person or a character, because a person is serving themselves. So, you know, that can work, but, you know, they're going to maybe move on more quickly, and a character is going to serve their character. So like, there's all these questions about, you know, their motivations and all this stuff. But in this experience, what would she do as an immersive theater actor? She's serving the narrative. She's going to try and make sure that you know, what the story is going, like what's going on in the story, that you're feeling the right things. So she'll wait, right? If she knows you're paying attention, she'll move on, because she's not going to break the experience for you. But if your attention is split and you're not really looking, she'll wait. And so there's a system in there, because we know where your head is, we know where your eyes are looking. We can say like, oh, somebody's not looking, like just hold Lucy, like don't let her move on until we know that we've got their attention. So we track, like, how long were you looking at Lucy in the eyes? How long were you looking at the thing that she was holding? How long were you looking other places? Is your hand moving toward the thing she's grabbing? All these things are just little, trying to read the body language of like the participant, so that Lucy's body language can mimic that. And it's all toward this idea of social presence. So this idea of presence, of being sharing the same space with someone, or with or having a new environment in VR. Social presence is about like feeling like you're hanging out with an actual real other person. And that's everything that we did in Wolves, was about doing that. And it all came from this idea of immersive theater, playing with the role of the interactive audience, using the space like a stage. And then, you know, the subtleties of body language and what it means when you break that and what it means when you do it right. And it was a really fascinating thing. And I think the way that the things we learned about storytelling in this medium from paying attention to the way that people were already telling stories that shared space and shared social space with people was really fascinating. And it, yeah, I mean, I could talk about it for hours. But one of the things that film sort of backgrounds, like it's a little different, right? Like I came from a more game-centric background, and Theo wanted me to talk to you guys about like maybe where like film backgrounds can fit in and how like how you can kind of feel your role in a process like this. And there's actually a lot of ways, right? I mean, like a writer, that's easy to think about. There's a couple things that are different. Like we don't use as traditional of film tools. We have to have like branches and stuff like that. So, you know, there's a lot of like go-to lines where it's like, okay, if they do this, go to this line. So you read the script a little different, but you don't write it that much different. And producers, I mean, like, if you're an organizational person, if you're somebody who is there to help a production move along, it's always a great way in any industry in the or any part of the entertainment industry production role where you're there seeing the ways the production is getting done and helping people where they need. A good producer is like in every experience has been a make or break for like, are people at each other's throats? Or is it like, is this thing going off without a hitch? And like film production skills and, you know, VR interactive production skills, they really do lend themselves to each other. We actually had an editor on Wolves, which I've never worked with an editor on anything but Wolves, but it was an amazing experience where all the previs was done where we had the mocap videos. We had videos from the mocap shoot. We had the lines from our voice actors, which were not always our mocap actors. And then we had our editor who's like piecing together all that so we could all see what, even on a 2D screen, like what we were striving for in the round. Effects artists, we have plenty of effects artists that came from film. If you're used to working in After Effects and you're comfortable moving into something like Houdini, we used a lot of Houdini effects in our thing, and it's just a matter of getting them to run in real time. But there's, you know, that's like this up and coming field that there's a lot of resources out there if you want to learn that. And then like myself, I'm a designer, but I think like the skills of like a director, somebody who's just constantly paying attention to the emotional flow of a piece. I worked basically hand in hand with the director, more in an assistant director role in this piece, because that's the importance of like, you're just always trying to keep the emotional through line. That's what your role is as a VR designer when you're working on an interactive storytelling piece like this. And then it was like, I don't know, choreographer, if anybody has thoughts about movement or space, like that's certainly like when you're blocking out a film, like you're thinking about these things, and it's just a matter of like, what happens when you can't cut? What happens when you feel the space? It definitely, you have to change your thinking, but you know, if you are putting storytelling first, that's always going to be what brings any of your skills through to any other type of interactive work. If you can maintain, if you can try and identify problems in the storytelling and fix them, like that's all it really takes for any of these things. But yeah, so that's everything I have. I went a little long. I think I got a little bit into my explanations